let me tell you a bit about Green Books. My co-host, Joanne, this was very much her idea, Joanne Knowles, and we have her to thank for setting this up. And we have a series of wonderful guests, and we'll tell you more about them towards the end. And we're absolutely delighted that Charles is going to be our first author that we're going to be having. The idea of Green Books is really to invite environmental authors covering a whole range of issues, from gardening to climate to electric cars to biodiversity. The idea is to really have conversations to stimulate, to inspire, to engage, and hopefully educate and give, like tonight, very practical skills as well. So the first one, I'd like to tell you a bit about Greening Steyning. Greening Steyning is an organisation that's been around for about 10 years. It's a voluntary group, and it covers Steyning, Bramber and Upper Beeding, which are all here in the South Downs National Park. I know a lot of you are from abroad and other parts of Britain, so you might not know West Sussex so well. It's a beautiful traditional part of the world here in the South Downs National Park. And Greening Steyning is set up as a group of like-minded people who really want to do something to improve the environment. And for those of you who live in Sussex, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about it. You know, whether you're a keen gardener, a nature lover, a bird watcher, a rambler, or someone who is moved and inspired by documentaries like David Attenborough's and Perfect Planet, many of us really are inspired to want to do something to avert the terrible climate and ecological crisis which we're really facing. And Greening Steyning is an opportunity to take action, to work with like-minded people, to make new friends and have fun while contributing to making our community what we believe can be one of the greenest, one of the healthiest, one of the happiest communities in the UK. We currently have over 800 members on our list, and we have over 100 volunteers, and we're always looking for people to join us. So throughout the evening, Joanna's going to put up some links, and we'll be emailing you regularly as well. Just to give you a flavour, we've in a few weeks' time, on February the 23rd, we've actually got a green quiz, which will be a lot of fun to test your knowledge of the environment and learn some exciting new information and talk to us about these issues. We've also got more green drinks coming and green books and green events. So there's always a lot happening, and please contact us and sign up for our newsletter on our webpage. So let's move on to the main reason why we're all here. We're very fortunate and honoured to welcome Charles Dowding as our guest speaker tonight for our first inaugural Green Books event. Charles, as I'm sure you all know, is a highly innovative gardener, and he's best known in many ways for no-dig gardening, but he's also the author of 10 books on caring for the soil and growing vegetables. And since 1982, he's created and cropped 4 no-dig market gardens on different soils, from stone to silt to clay. In the 1980s, he cropped 7.5 acres of no-dig beds, and in the 1990s, he farmed in France. Currently, he grows vegetables on a 1/4 of an acre, 1,000 square metres in Somerset, in southwest England, and he sells about £20,000 of harvest locally. Mainly salad leaves and many vegetables are served on his courses at Homemakers. He's also written an annual calendar of sowing dates, runs an amazing YouTube channel, which is quite superb. I watched his videos, they're really outstanding, and has had 36 million views, which is amazing. He writes for national gardening magazines and gives talks and courses at home. He's created 2 online courses, No-Dig Gardening and Growing Success, and he's got a 3rd course coming out later this month. I know that Joanne's going to put up his Twitter, Instagram, YouTube and Facebook. Lots of ways to get in touch with him. So I'd like to now hand over to Charles and offer him a great big welcome from us at Green Steyning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And it's very nice to kind of meet you all. I still find it strange giving these presentations. I did one for Kew Gardens a couple of weeks ago, and they had a lot of people there, and you know, I don't know who they are. And then I was getting messages afterwards from, you know, old friends. Hey, I was at your talk Monday evening. It was really interesting. And so I'm sure I know some of you. So my background, going back a long way, for me, it's kind of interesting now because I've reached a certain age where you can look quite a long way backwards. And, you get more perspective. Growing old is not all bad, actually. I'm 62 now, and I've got a perspective where I can see back in the 80s, when I was in my 20s and young and hippie and aspiring, thinking, the world could be greener, and we all had great hopes. And looking back on it, not many of them have been realized. It's a bit sobering, actually, to think that. And there's organic farming. I started off really more organic than anything. No dig I was doing, but nobody was talking about soil in those days. It's kind of weird. I was in the Soil Association, but they weren't really talking about soil. Hang on a minute, what's that about? They've become a campaigning organization more against chemicals, in my view. That's what they were spending most of their time and effort on. I mean, if there's anyone listening from the Soil Association now, I'd be interested to hear your viewpoint on that. But that's how it seems to me, particularly with the benefit of perspective. And it's only recently that soil has become quite a key topic, and it's now realized how important it is. But back in the 80s, when I started, it wasn't. And yet, if you go further back to the 1930s and 40s, it was. So you've got these kind of cycles all through history. And when you have a bit of age yourself, you can spot them and see that, there is nothing new under the sun. And every so often we discover something again. Actually, it was done before. You just need to look back a bit. And that's where history is so illuminating. And like the Soil Association, that when they were founded in the 1940s, a lot of it was about, wait for it, mycorrhizal fungi. These things that we suddenly hear about now and seem so brand new and exciting. There was a scientist working on Wareham Heath in the 1930s. She was called Rayner. And she worked for the Forestry Association in the UK. And she discovered that adding a bit of special or good quality homemade compost to the potting mixes that they were using for their conifer trees gave her amazing results. The trees grew much better than it looked like they should have done just by doing the chemical analysis of the nutrients. She was, like a lot of scientists, even then in the 1920s and 30s, they were really into chemistry, and that was the cutting edge, and nobody really talked much about biology. So this was a bit of a thing, and she expanded more her research and really found out quite a lot about mycorrhizal fungi, which until then were hardly known and recognized. And then she teamed up a bit with Alba Howard, who is a founder of modern compost making. He started in India, in the British Raj. And between the two of them, they really pioneered a lot of knowledge about soil microbes. That was in the 1930s and 40s, and then the Soil Association was founded on that basis. And then they forgot it all. They got into sort of being anti-chemistry. And for me, in gardening, I see a lot of dichotomy between biology and chemistry. So you've got, on the one hand, soil biologists who until recently have not been acknowledged for having much of value to say. And then you've got the chemists who talk all the time about nutrients and leaching. And I've noticed in some of the questions this evening, those kinds of questions come up a lot. And for me, they always reflect what is the way of thinking out there. A question is very revealing how people phrase things. Like if they're concerned about something, well, why are you concerned about it? Where have you got this idea from? That question. If you spread compost in the autumn, do the nutrients leach out of it? I'm asked that one quite a bit. That's completely missing the main point, which is that compost is not really about nutrients. It's about unlocking nutrients. Nutrients are present in most soils already. I was lucky enough to share a platform at a conference in Norway with Professor Elaine Ingham from Oregon, about 2 years ago, in those days when we could do conferences. And she made this outrageous statement, which is, wow, all the soils in the world have enough nutrients. It's just they're lacking in the biological key, if you like, to unlock them. And that's why she's really hot on compost, but she's also really hot on well-made compost with all the right microbes, which do this amazing work of unlocking food in the soil. And not only food, but enabling structure. Compost is about feeding soil organisms so that they can get busy, they can multiply, they can do the work that diggers and fertilizers think they're doing and need to do. But if you get the biology right, they can do it all, and they do it much better. So with no dig, in particular, you don't need fertilizers. So I don't use any fertilizers. I'm using compost, and it's not only about the nutrients in the compost, it's about unlocking that, invigorating and vitalizing your soil. And then I just thought I'd give you a little bit of history here. I don't know if you can see this photograph. That's me in 1989, when I was young and hippie. That's the Observer magazine. It's a national publication in the UK. And looking back on that now, it makes me think, wow, times have moved on a bit, and yet also times haven't moved on. The biology of soil is now hot news, where when I started growing in the 1980s, nobody thought that mycorrhizal fungi worked with vegetables to help them to grow. It was only, they were only given credit for working with trees. And I was so disappointed because I just felt, surely this can't be right. And now finally we are finding out that, yeah, it is. No-dig, with no-dig, you've just got to open up your mind to thinking differently and bypassing a lot of the traditional knowledge. And that's why I wrote my book on myths and misconceptions, because I feel that many people are laboring under misapprehensions, which cause so much more work. You know, gardeners have been given long lists of rules, and rules are okay if they're good ones, but most of the rules are given it's a kind of trait of humanity, I think, that, you know, people like to put themselves in positions of authority, and then they can start to tell other people how to do things. And I think all of us need to question more. We need to question a lot of the rules, if you like, that we've been given. Just thinking of one, like, for example, deep planting, or, you know, plants going deep into the soil. People say, how can that work with no dig? If you haven't loosened and aerated, how can you grow deep rooting vegetables? Well, the assumption, most questions like that are based on an assumption. In this case, the assumption is that soil cannot be loose and aerated without humanity being involved in some way. Whereas actually nature does it much better. So I remember reading back in the 90s stories of how you grew parsnips in clay soil, and you had to make a hole with a crowbar and fill that with sand, and then you put your parsnip seed in the sand, and oh, that enabled it to go down into the clay. Actually, when you do no dig on clay, you find out how easy it is to get parsnips to go down. And the problem, if anything, is how to get them out again. So, you know, you can bypass all that stuff that you're supposed to do. And with no dig, gardening becomes just much more joyful, because you got very few sort of calculations to do, if you like. Your one main thing is you're working to feed the soil with enough life, and then that will look after itself. You have enough food. I give the same amount of mulch to all my vegetables. I'm like, you know, this thing about heavy feeders and light feeders, you don't need to know any of that. Throw that one out the window. Another one is, actually, interestingly, companion planting. I think that's really confuses a lot of people, because I see these lists, you know, like this plant gets on with that one, and this one gets on with that one, and this one doesn't get on with that one. You've got to be careful. Before long, people are tearing their hair out. Where can I put my broad beans? They must be next to the onions and so on. And actually, what it's all about is which plants can coexist in terms of just having enough light and availability of water and everything like that. It's just a growing an understanding. Once you've worked with plants a bit, you can understand what plants can go where next to other ones. And, you know, to cut a long story short, most plants can go next to most other plants, as long as you give them enough space. In fact, I would say pretty much all other plants, really. And with no dig, you've got the ability to intersow and interplant, which is a lovely method where you can set plants in the ground between existing plants, which, say your onions are going to come ready to harvest in early August, and it's currently early July, and you've got some beetroot modules that you sowed in June, you multi-sowed, you pop them in between the onions, and it looks like, no, there's not enough space there. But because the onions are going to come out, there is enough room by the time the beetroot have got growing. Plants, when they're little, don't need a lot of space like nutrients. They need that later on. And actually, when they're little, what they need more than anything is welcoming, friendly plants around them. So that's where interplanting, intersowing really comes into its own, because you actually, you know, in classical thinking, you know, fertilizers, nutrients, and all that, as competition is the sort of paradigm. Whereas this is actually about plants, how they cooperate. through fungal networks and all sorts of other things. I think things we probably don't even know about, in fact. And I've noticed often that putting in these little plants, which look as if they should be overwhelmed by the existing plants, actually, by the time you twist out the existing plants because they finished, the little ones, suddenly they just go whoosh. And they were clearly just quietly getting established. Foresters are now saying this, they're noticing in the forest, the little saplings, which used to be thought the big trees were overpowering and shading them. And turns out they were helping them. And so, because the big trees know that the little trees need a helping hand for when the big trees aren't going to be there anymore. It's that kind of thing. So a nice spirit of community and cooperation. It's been talked about a lot in forests. And I think we can have growing awareness of it in vegetable gardens as well. Vegetable gardens, why can't you can have a vegetable garden like a forest? People talk about forest gardens with trees, but actually, your vegetables are a forest. If you're small, that kale is like an enormous tree, for example. So think of it in those terms. And multi-sowing is another nice example of this, where you're putting in lots of seedlings together in a clump, and they do amazingly well. And it's like, it wasn't me who thought of the phrase, actually. It was someone on one of my courses here who said, well, they're going in the ground with their mates. It's like, well, yeah, if you think about it, that makes perfect sense. So why would a plant enjoy being in the ground miles apart from another plant? And the answer is they don't. They like being close, especially when they're small. So you just got to work out as a gardener where the limit is. You obviously can't overcrowd them too much. The thing about companion planting is like, I put these photos, say, on Instagram I've popped in fennel between spinach. And the number of people who say, I thought fennel didn't get on with other plants. I've been told that. So there's a lot of these stories out there. And I would urge you to ignore most of them, if not all. If you see an opportunity to get a plant in somewhere, just go for it. With a bit of knowledge about, the fennel example I mentioned, I put between spinach. I knew the spinach were going to be finishing within about a month. I was going to just twist them out because they would be going up to flower. This was between April and May. And then that would allow the fennel to grow big when the spinach are gone. And then before the fennel finished, I popped in French beans under the fennel. So that then the fennel's finishing while the French beans are beginning. And then you twist out the fennel, harvest. And before you know it, you've got French beans cropping. And then under the French beans, I popped in some radish for the autumn. So the French beans finished end of August, twisted them plants out, or cut them off at root. I'll leave all the roots in. And then we got crop of radish in October. So that one example, there were 4 harvests in that small area. And with no fertilizer or anything, no more, just one application of compost the previous autumn to unleash all that possibility and potential. And that's where, with no dig, where you're encouraging the soil to express itself and enabling it. That's another way of putting it. I think often our interventions go the other way. We think we have to do something and we're actually making it worse. And then before you know it, you need to buy fertilizer and slug pellets and all the other stuff that there's hordes of people out there desperate to sell. And I think it's one reason actually why no dig has struggled to make it onto the main stage, because it doesn't tie in with corporate agenda. So much of what happens in the world basically is done for money. I'm not wanting to cast a value judgment on that. We all need money, but the emphasis is too much on money. And so in gardening magazines, for example, editors are going to favor stories that will mean somebody needs to buy a bit of fertilizer a week. And that's going perhaps a bit black and white, but I'm sure you get the idea. And in a more positive way, no dig is just so nice, because what do you need? You need some compost. That's a clear starting point. Ongoing though, you don't need so much compost. And I need to make it clear, I think, in my writing that there's an assumption that no dig needs a lot of compost. If you look at the yields per kilogram from, say, on my dig no dig trial beds, they have the same amount of compost, and the no dig bed gives 15% more harvest every year from the same amount of compost. So for me, if you look at it in kilos of food per pound per kilo of compost, no dig actually uses less compost than if you're digging cultivating, because when you're digging, you are releasing carbon, you're losing organic matter, you're disrupting it and the whole process. So digging is a very inefficient way of gardening. Generally, how do we get in this situation? Doing something that is kind of bad, and It also has bad results, like you get a lot more weeds. I'm sure some of you have noticed that in reverse when you go no dig. Wow, I mean, I get hear this comment a lot. It's so nice. There's not many weeds. I've got time to be more creative and grow more food and harvest and all that kind of thing. So how do we get in the situation where we're doing something that's kind of productive? Well, that's a good one to think about. And maybe, Paul, I should stop there. Carry on talking too long otherwise. And do you want to start throwing some questions at me?
Well, no, we've had lots of questions. We're now up to almost 260 people, which is wonderful. So I think one of the questions that certainly when I was watching your YouTube videos is how can we, and I'm thinking particularly for people maybe with smaller gardens, what would you recommend in terms of producing compost? How would we go about that? What is there a right way to do it?
That's difficult. If you got, if you got a really, you can't produce compost if you don't have the raw materials. So if you've got a really small garden, I don't see how you could magic into existence a lot of materials to make a compost heap. But having said that, if you've only got a small garden, you're probably not going to need a lot of compost. But I think most of us gardeners, where we want to be producing a lot of food in a small area, we've got to look at using other people's waste. I mean, here, for example, I'll go out with my scythe and cut the lovely long grass growing beside the road. And that brings in quite a few barrow loads of raw material every year. And nettles as well, docks. I'm not afraid to put weed seeds in the compost heap. If you can get enough stuff in there and get it hot, then that will kill the weed seeds. But yeah, become a scrounger. There is a lot of raw material out there. I mean, during the lockdown last spring, because people had been in the habit of taking their garden waste to the local compost facility, it used to be called a dump, and they started bringing it to me. So, it's like, it's all out there if you can just find it. Before COVID, restaurants used to have lots of coffee grounds. I don't know if that's going to carry on there. But yeah, it's that kind of thing. And with not needing very much, I'm going to give you an example, small garden. So my dig no dig bed's 1.5 metre wide, 5 metres long. That's 5 feet wide, 16 feet long, 100 kilos, 220 pounds of vegetables every year. Now, you might not achieve that as a beginner, but if you were, but yeah, so I'll give you an idea. You can get a lot of food from a small area.
That's amazing. I know that where we are in West Sussex, and I suspect for a lot of people on this call, bindweed is a major problem. Is there anything you'd recommend for that, or maybe any other common weeds, or is it not an issue for you?
Yeah, no, I've had bindweed. It's very interesting weed though, bindweed, because I know from experience also, back in the 80s, I had a garden, my mother's garden. I was still doing some digging work to please her and tried to dig out some bindweed and couch grass, and it never worked. And when you stop digging, the soil calms down. It doesn't have the same need to grow these weeds. There's an element here of soil as a living organism. And I think it behoves us to think it in those terms. Think of it actually as an entity, if you like. And if you're not disturbing it, it doesn't have the same need to recover. Think of those words. In nature, any organism, animal, person, whatever that's disturbed needs to recover. We do, certainly. So soil needs to recover. How does it recover? Literally, it recovers with weeds. So you don't disturb it, you definitely get less weed growth. I've got rid of bindweed, firstly by mulching, and that, so far so good, that slows it down. Then it pokes up through. And at that point, if you didn't know, you might think, oh, this isn't working, I'll give up and walk away. But if you keep pulling it, this is where the commitment bit comes in. Keep pulling it every week, say, minimum. Every 5 days is better. In summer, every time you remove the regrowth, the new growth, that's tarring out, exhausting the parent root below. The parent root of bindweed, or any weed that's in the soil, a perennial weed, they've only got so much energy. They are not invincible. People talk about mare's tail going down to sort of the depth of coal mines or even to Australia. Or not really. But they do go very deep, and they do have a lot of reserves. Mare's tail is probably the most difficult one. I had a guy on a course here, and he said, I got rid of mare's tail by hoeing. It took 11 years. But the bindweed, I got rid of it in 2 years. So, it is possible. And when I say get rid of it, I mean 100% completely. So then there's no more. And that's why it's worth getting stuck in and staying committed in those first, in the case of bindweed, 2 years. Couch grass, I reckon, is less than a year. That's gone completely. Creeping buttercup, 4 months maybe. Dandelion, 6 months. All different perennial weeds have a time limit, you know, beyond which the reserves they've got in their roots, they're going to run out and they can't grow anymore. Ground elder, maybe 10 months. And you've just got to have a go, but do it in the confidence that when you're not disturbing the soil, it's going to be a lot easier. In the end, you will expend a lot less energy, but you have got to stay committed for that period of time until it stops growing. And actually, just sorry, one other thing is you need to mulch the edge as well. You know, if you say you had a bed growing bindweed and you just mulched your bed, but you didn't mulch the path around, which is still growing bindweed, then the bindweed will just spread back into the bed from the path. So you've got to go a bit wider than your desired area. Cardboard, you know, cardboard's so useful for that, but you might need to put it on 3 times a year. When weeds start to go through it, if we're talking perennial weeds, put more cardboard on top. This is not like every year. This is just getting rid of those perennial weeds in the first instance. I mean, here I'm using cardboard when I'm cleaning ground of weeds at the beginning, but not after that. So it's again, it's a one-off. It's that year one, I call it. It's the more difficult time.
That's the key. Excellent. Okay, we had lots of questions from the audience. Here's one from Lucy. Do you think we, and therefore our children, have lost the art of observation because we rely on rules, books, internet, and we are told rather than looking?
Brilliant. Yeah, well asked. Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. I'm really always encouraging people to do exactly that. And you know, why believe everything you're told? Why believe me? It's like, I would just say that most of all of my teaching is based on experience, but I think a lot of what we hear, I don't know why it is, but people repeat things. I get asked the most ridiculous thing. Oh, I heard that. They'll say, I was told that. Well, why believe it just because you were told it? You know, that doesn't make it true. And maybe it's because gardening, there are a lot of beginners now, particularly, and so that's an opportunity for people with only a little bit of knowledge to pretend they've got a lot of knowledge and kind of take over. A lot of that goes on. If you're in an allotment, you know, you'll get all these old guys come up, you know. Ooh. I had a classic case of that actually on YouTube, a guy in Holland, and he said, I've been watching your videos, I thought that's great, I'll go no dig. And he was out there, and he'd not done gardening before. He put the compost on the top 10 centimeters, and he said it was the garden expert on the allotment, came up to him and was quite heavy about it. And they said, yeah, that's just not going to work. You've got to dig it in. And he said his approach that he used was he just nodded his head and said, yeah, okay. And, you know, guy then walks off. He can't really do more than that. But he just carried on. He didn't dig the compost in or anything. And then he said, towards the end of May, he started to notice that his plants are actually doing quite a bit better than these other guys, including this one. And this guy came up to him and said, oh, you know, he was making favourable noises. And then he saw that this man who'd been telling him that was putting compost on top. So, you know, that's an example of how we're sticking to what we feel is right. We can actually change the world a bit. Because no-dig is a very powerful method, I think, for that. It makes you think. It goes against a lot of what we've been told. And so it's a very healthy thing, I think, to be sceptical. Yeah, so carry on with that.
No, absolutely. We have a question here from Hannah. Do you have to cover pathways, and would you use wood chip for that?
Yeah. Well, see, in that question, that's an interesting one. There's another question is hidden. Like, Hannah, are you using wooden sides to your beds? Because if you are, don't worry to answer, by the way, because I'll take both eventualities. If you've got wooden sides to your beds, then you can get away with having weeds in your path because the wood side is a barrier to the weeds going in. If you don't have wooden sides, which is what I recommend actually, because for 2 reasons. One, it saves a lot of money, but also you've got less habitat for slugs and other pests, including woodlice can do quite a bit of damage to plants if they get very numerous. And slugs and woodlice live in rotting wood, which is what happens to wooden sides in the end. So if you remove your wooden sides, then you do need to have weed-free paths. But then you also notice when you've got weed-free paths that the vegetables you grow on your beds can root into the paths. So that path soil is a massively overlooked resource. We're just walking on it and we think, oh, kind of dead soil or whatever. I don't know what people think. But it's not compacted soil. It's living soil still. It just happens to be what we've designated as paths. So yeah, look after your paths, mulch the weeds. Cardboard, as in the first instance, cardboard and a bit of wood chip, and most weeds will die. If, like I was saying, a bit of couch grass or bindweed pokes through, keep pulling it until it's dead. Then you've got a clean path. And then what we noticed here, for example, in dry summer months, you get a storm of rain in August, and the vegetables along the edges of the beds, not the ones in the middle, but on the edges of the beds, are bigger. And that's because they can send their roots into the path, which is free resource for them, pick up the moisture that fell overnight. Plants send out a lot of opportunistic roots. And so, you know, paths enable them use of all these resources like rain that's otherwise not being fully exploited. So yeah, look after your paths, weed free. No wooden sides if you can manage that. Might take a while to take them apart if you've got wooden sides.
Excellent. We have a question here from Benedict. Have you ever tested the result of no dig on nutrient levels of your vegetables?
Oh, well, I'd love to. I last was it 2 autumns ago? Yeah, so it was 15 months ago now. I bought a nutrient measurer from, now what are they called? Dan Kittredge, bionutrient kind of thing. And I paid $400 for this thing, and then it never arrived. It turned out they'd had a rush on them, and so it never got delivered. But it's something I want to find out about. And having said that, it's not as easy to measure, I think, as we'd like. You know, I'm actually quite skeptical of science. Until recently, I've not had my soil tested hardly ever. When I have, it's given contradictory results, because I don't think that science has yet got to the point of being able to measure living processes enough. You know, like, for example, nutrients. Well, how much do we understand the way that food feeds us? And just recently, I don't know if you know how much you've heard about it, but suddenly everyone's talking about microbes as absolute key. And microbes in our gut, enabling the whole digestive process to be efficient and enabling nutrients to be available to us. You know, so you could measure the nutrients in your vegetables, but it's not going to do you a lot of good if you haven't got the microbes in your gut to use them. So, you know, that's where our bodies and also plants are much more clever than scientific measurements. And that's why I'm skeptical actually of soil tests, because I would rather use my plants. You know, even those of you with not much experience, I think most people can look at plants and say, well, that plant looks well and healthy and strong, or whatever it might be. You know, that's what I'd encourage you to to develop rather than scientific measurement. I don't want to pour cold water on that idea totally, but I think you can see where I'm coming from. You know, it's a very big picture there.
No, it's good points. We have Debbie asking, for no dig, do you mix compost in with a shovel or digging fork, or do you mean no digging at all, not even by hand tools, just layer compost on top?
Yeah, Debbie, it's as simple as that. There is no digging. You don't dig it in. That's the, you know, I'm guessing that you've got a background in maybe more traditional gardening. I don't know, to actually ask that question, because I find actually that beginners launch into no dig really easily. And you know, kids even. I've got quite a few kids who are following me like on YouTube. I love their comments. You know, they're sort of 15 or whatever, and they just say, hey, this is great. No preconceptions. But yeah, there's absolutely no need, no desire, and it's not good either to try and fork anything in or mix it in. We're running various trials here where digging in the compost, you know, or even forking it is depressing yield. Basically, the plants don't grow quite so healthy. So yeah, keep it simple.
Excellent. Well, Charles, we've got a very international audience, and we've now got Kelly from Los Angeles in California. And she's wondering if we need to approach no dig differently in our increasingly hot climate. I find that we struggle with soil drying out, thinking that no dig approach will actually be quite beneficial.
Well, yeah, I mean, it'll certainly help, because every time you disturb soil or open it up, you're losing moisture, that's for sure. And more than that, you are breaking all of that mycorrhizal network, which we're starting now to realize is so important for helping plant roots to find moisture. Like I notice here in the summer, we even get dry weather in the UK. And sometimes in a dry summer, you know, I'm amazed how well my plants flourish without, I haven't got any irrigation system here, but I will water if things really need it. But they do amazingly well, and obviously within reason. But what mycorrhizal fungi can do is they're so tiny, they can go into crevices in soil which roots are too big to get into, and the mycorrhizal fungi can suck out the moisture from them, and then they team up, mutual symbiosis with the plant roots, and in return for the plant roots giving them carbohydrates from photosynthesis from the sun, the mycorrhizal fungi find moisture and nutrients. So that's one nice example of how no-dig wins. And do have a look, Holly, at the videos. The video I made with Kevin, Epic Gardening in San Diego in December, where we both made a bed and we're swapping notes. And he is mulching with, as well as compost, he's put straw on top. And so that is conserving moisture, which he needs to. And we both made this bed at the same time in December. And I planted mine up here and he planted his up. And we're going to revisit this probably sometime in March. And I'm sure that his bed's going to be like whoosh with all the lovely warm winter in here. My plants have hardly grown at all, you know, but they'll catch up a bit in the spring. But yeah, anyway, good luck to you in Los Angeles. No dig, and don't worry if the surface looks dry. You know, that's something I think does confuse people sometimes, that even the surface compost, people worry if it's dry. Well, yeah, it will get dry. Even if it was under straw, you know, it's going to get dry in the end because the plants will suck the moisture out of it. You will have to give some water. No dig is going to help. That's the best one could say, really.
Excellent. Karen has a question. I have planted field beans in my new allotment plot. Is that as good as mulching over winter?
Oh, that's interesting. Are you able to ask her when she planted them, or sowed them, I should say?
Yeah, perhaps Karen, if you can communicate with Joanne, and we'll come back to that because we've got so many questions coming in, so we'll come back to that. Is no-dig gardening synonymous with raised bed gardening? And that's from Denise.
Well, yes and no. I mean, it's interesting that, you know, when I started out in the 80s, I was growing in raised beds, but I didn't have wooden sides, but that was very new and sort of fashionable then, and Jeff Hamilton and people doing it. But I think raised beds have become synonymous with the wooden sides, which is something I urge people to get away from for the reasons I've mentioned. So in a way, yes, in a way, no. I mean, I would say it's good to be beds, but have beds that look more like mounds. Think of it like the waves of the sea. So your pathways are slight hollow, your bed's a slight rise, and you've got use of all the sides of the bed to grow on as well as the surface. You don't want your sides too steep, otherwise water runs down, that kind of thing. So yes and no.
Okay. Karen said that she planted her field beans in November.
Okay, yeah, that's fairly late. I would say if you wanted that, what you call a mulching effect, where the leaves are more or less covering the ground without having to use too many seeds, get them in even in October. And you could do that thing where you interplant or intersow. So supposing you had even leeks or kale, sow some beans next October, even late September actually, between your existing crops, so that then as they finish and you twist out their roots, leave most of their roots in the ground, your beans are there to grow on. And yeah, give you a leaf cover over winter, and then you've just got to work out how you're going to get rid of the bean plants ready to sow and plant. You know, I wouldn't leave them too long in the spring because they're going to keep sucking moisture out. If we have a spring like we did last year, the soil's drying out fast all the time. And you know, that's a bit of a misunderstanding. People say it's got leaf cover, well, it won't be drying out, but the leaves are sucking moisture themselves. So, you know, there is quite a bit of moisture loss happening. So with a green cover over winter, you've got a lot of things to think about like that. It's in a way more difficult than using compost, but if you haven't got any compost, yeah, it's a good thought.
Okay, excellent. And from Richard wants to know, would you loosen compacted soil before applying the compost, or just let nature do the job?
I would ask in return, is it really compacted soil? For me, most of the time when I hear people use that term, if I ever get the chance to look at it or see a photo of what it looks like and what's growing in it, it's not truly compacted. The compacted is a massively overused word. And, you know, think of it another way. Soil's natural condition is firm. Firm soil is good. We've been sold a lie by the makers of rototillers and rotavators that soil has to be loose and fluffy. It does not. That's a really unhealthy state for soil. You know, that's broken out all the fungal networks, exposed a lot of bacteria to oxygen, killed a lot of spiders, goodness knows what else. So firm soil, undisturbed, which some people would call compact or compacted. And I have a feeling that's where he's coming from there. I could be wrong. But if you've truly got a compacted soil, it's pretty rare, for one thing, and it would be horrible. It's like if you did manage to get a fork in and lever a bit of it out, it would be smelling sulphurous. It would be bits of blue and orange. I've seen it. I've seen, where tractors have driven on wet clay and squashed all the life out of soil to the point that compacted means that nothing can live in there, and it's kind of become swamp-like. So generally, I think in gardens allotments, it's very, very rare that you've got what most people would call a compacted soil. It's just firm, and it's fine, yes, to answer the question, fine to put the compost on top. Better, actually, because if you see plants growing, there must be organisms living in the soil. And so if you mulch the plants, say, with cardboard, if you haven't got any plants, maybe you'd be keeping on top of the weeds, or there should still be some organisms there. But just put the compost on top and let nature do it.
Okay, great. And from Nicola wants to know, I have inherited plastic covering on my allotment path with weeds growing through. Should I just remove the covering and mulch?
Brilliant. Yeah, these are great questions because they bring up the things that, actually, that one is a classic one, because so often I see that on allotments and people put down these membranes and they think, oh, job done, nice weed-free path. And then before you know it, well, for one thing, worms actually can push up. They can even push a cast through some of these slightly porous membranes, and then stuff falling on top. And yeah, before you know it, you've got an inch or two of soil on top of the membrane. It's disappeared. And then people inherit allotments and they discover this stuff down in there. It's a horrible poison. So absolutely, yeah, pull it up, get rid of it. And if you've got a lot of weeds in the path, that's chance for cardboard and a bit of wood chip in the first instance. Ongoing, with pathways, if you 6 months of cardboard, say, to just, you might need to do a second layer, just smother the weeds again. Once you've got rid of them, you still need to weed your path, but it should be manageable by hand without using cardboard, because cardboard does encourage slugs. I'm amazed we got to this point actually with very little mention of slugs, but that's why I reckon you do want a cardboard every year.
Okay.
Okay.
And Matthew wants to know if he can mulch and start no dig on a stony border.
Well, basically, yeah. I mean, like my first soil back in the 1980s, the technical definition of it was Cotswold brash, and it was more stone than soil. It was very, very stony limestone. And no dig worked fine on that. The only thing was I couldn't grow a very straight parsnip or carrot. I couldn't sell them to the supermarket. We did sell veg to the supermarket, actually. But yeah, stone is fine. I mean, someone was asking about concrete. Can you make a no-dig bed on concrete? Well, you can. One thing you need, though, is for there to be a slight slope. Actually, you would need wooden sides for something like that. That's just to hold the compost in. I would say minimum 8-inch depth if you could manage that, 20 centimeters. If you're shallower than that, you'd need to just grow salads. But this is for concrete. But on stony soil, yeah, absolutely, no problem. You can grow anything.
Okay. And Kate wants to know if no dig works in a polytunnel, and if so, does the method differ from an outside bed?
Well, yeah, it certainly does. It's fantastic, actually. One lovely thing is how you can really, for me, polytunnel space is so precious. You've put up this cover, it's quite expensive, and you're spending quite a bit of time watering and all that kind of thing. And you want to maximize the value of what you've got there, that every square centimeter, square inch needs to be productive. So with no dig, you just keep planting. We often get 3 crops here. You fit in another crop. You're conserving moisture. So like in my polytunnel, where we got winter salad, we picked them hard on the 21st December, winter solstice day. So we sell a lot of salad just before Christmas. And then deliberately, though, we pick the plants really what I call hard, which means that we're taking off outer leaves, not cutting, but we don't leave many little leaves in the middle. So poor little plants, they're quite small over Christmas, but I'm just doing that for selfish reasons, I'm afraid, not hurting the plant, but it delays the regrowth. So it grows back more slowly if you pick it hard. So it gives me time in January to do a few other things. And we only did our subsequent pick 6 weeks later, and that was yesterday. we picked those same plants, and that's the longest I'll ever go without picking a plant. But these same plants will now keep cropping. We've already picked them 4 times since November, and they will keep cropping until the middle of April, because polytunnel in the winter, it doesn't keep out the frost, but it's brilliant for keeping off the wind. More than anything, the wind and the weather and the lashing rain and everything like that. So we can pick nice quality leaves, and these same plants that were sown September, transplanted October, keep reducing until the middle of April. We just keep coming back every week to harvest. And the interesting thing about the last pick that we did in that 6-week time interval was that in that whole 6 weeks, we had not watered at all. So that's where you need a few different skills. You need to certainly understand about watering, not overwater. I think most people overwater their gardens. It's good, for example, between watering to see some dry surface. Dry surface does not mean your soil is all dry. Wait until it dries a bit before you water it again. And that way you can have less weeds germinating, you have less mildew on leaves, for example. Like the lettuce that we picked, grown in 6 weeks right in the middle of winter. We have very little sun here. Yeah, for those of you in the States who are listening, our sunshine total in January was 33 hours for the whole month. It's like that's 1 hour a day. It's mostly grey and cloudy, and for salad plants that can really encourage mildew on the leaves, and that does slightly link to my watering. If you're in a drier, sunnier climate, you wouldn't want to go 6 weeks without watering. But that's where observation is so good. And as a gardener, I think gardening, even more than farming, we're in a really wonderful position. We're very close to our plants. Farmers now, they're often stuck on top of a huge tractor cab, miles above their acres, and they've lost that contact, and they're getting readouts on computer screens in the tractor that telling them, this corner of the field yielded more pounds per square foot than that one, and so on. As gardeners, we don't need any of that computer printout. We can see it and we can assimilate it. And linking back to the earlier question about questioning things, and observing. And that lovely saying, there's no manure like the gardener's shadow. Farmers have it, there's no manure like the farmer's foot. And what that means is you're bringing your observation and bringing yourself to the show is actually helping your garden in terms of you seeing what needs doing. And I think also it's an energy thing. For me, this is the future, actually. I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here, but I think you'll find this interesting because, if you start thinking about these things and how plants grow and how nature around us works, and then you see things working that shouldn't work in terms of modern science, like biodynamics. How the hell does that work? If I always think if I've got someone with me who's very scientific, in inverted commas, whatever that means, but very analytical, I just need to get talking about biodynamics, and I can see their hackles rise because they cannot measure it. And for me, that's what a lot of scientists hate, is stuff that they can't measure. They will deny it because it's outside of their domain of knowledge, if you like. And that's where I think the excitement lies, because that's where new things are waiting to be discovered. Biodynamics, it's been around a long time. For me, the best evidence that it works is all the farmers doing it. Farmers are not stupid people, and they do things that pay, that work, and a lot of them are biodynamic. And yet science still hasn't caught up with that one. How does that work? And there's a lot of other things. This thing of us, the energy we bring to the garden. That's what green fingers are. Green thumb in American. We can bring that energy to our plants, and then I could go on. Actually, I'll probably blow your minds a bit, but check it out. Anyway, the whole thing of energy. I'll stop there for now.
That is very interesting. Well, we've got a question now from Roger about how do you plant and crop potatoes? Surely you have to dig them out of the ground.
Yeah, I love that one. That's like I ask that a lot. It's brilliant. Just rephrase the question a bit there. So what it is, you pull them. Because it's to do with how potatoes grow. It's a bit of a misunderstanding that it's often said that potatoes need loose soil to grow. These statements are fascinating when you analyze them, because some of the words are just not quite appropriate. If we just take that one, potatoes need loose soil to grow in, what actually potato tubers need loose soil to develop in. You've got to take the different aspects of how potato grows. Potato plants can root. They can send their roots down into clay soil, undisturbed, dense, heavy, not compacted, but firm. And so in that sense, potato plants can grow in firm soil, but they just need the loose soil on top for the tubers, the potatoes we eat, to develop in, which are all clustered on the surface in quite loose conditions. And so even people who are used to digging out potatoes, you know, they didn't really need to. If you get all your hands around all stems at the same time, when they're ready, which is shown to you by the leaves starting to go a bit yellow, not totally, but just losing their full green luster, all the stems, and gently ease upwards, you will find that 3/4 of your potatoes will come up, and then have a rummage, which is not the same as a dig, you know, just have a little, even with your fingers, maybe a trowel, and find the potatoes lower down. With no dig, because you haven't loosened the soil below, the potato tubers, the potatoes themselves, do not go so deep in the ground. That's kind of common sense, isn't it, if you think about it? So therefore, your harvest is quite close to the surface, and you can get it out without digging, but it does cause some disturbance, I'll grant you that. You know, potatoes are not brilliant from that point of view, and you have to mess around the surface to get them out. And parsnips actually are another one. We were digging some parsnips last week, and that involves, the way I do it, because my soil is pretty heavy, that, like I say, the parsnips go in. The job is to get them out. We put a spade in right vertically next to the parsnip and give it a little lever and pull on the crown of the parsnip while doing that, and you can ease it upwards. And sometimes you get a root sort of 2 feet, 60 centimeters long. It's amazing. You know, you can see how it's gone down right into that heavy soil below. And then what I'll do after that is I'll tread the soil back down, because I want my soil to be firm. Same with potatoes. So don't be afraid of ever, sometimes, you know, walk on your beds is good, actually. Make it firm again.
Okay, brilliant. Well, I think we've got time for one more question, and then we'll wrap up as we're coming up to 8:30. And this is a question from Viv. Is it worth growing green manures?
Oh, great. Well, yes and no. I mean, if you want to grow vegetables, that's what I'd encourage everyone to do. You know, this is where sometimes the paradigm or the advice, the methods we've been given take over from the primary objective. The primary objective for me is to grow food. And why grow green manure if you can grow food? So there's most of the time in a garden, you can keep your beds cropped with something to eat all year long, which means you won't have a space or time to grow green manure. It's absolutely not mandatory, but if you did have a space that was not growing something before the growing season fizzles out, then yeah, sow green manure. A nice one actually is mustard, white mustard, Synapsis Alba. Here I sowed some this year on the 1st of October because I had 2 crops. I'd had my spinach, and then I'd had some chicory radicchios. They'd finished, and I scattered this mustard seed on top, and within a month it was a lovely green sward like a lawn. We actually cut some for salad leaves, so that was good. We got a bit of harvest, and then it grows up, and then it's killed by frost. And basically what that's doing is it's trapping energy from the sun, turning into carbon, and that's going into the soil. And so it's a net gain. So for me, just to be really clear on this one, because this one is often gets confused, I think. You know, people say to me, why aren't they look at my garden now and they say, oh, a lot of your beds are empty, bare soil. It's like, oh my God. But it's not there. It's covered in a mulch of compost. And in our climate here, for early sowings, it won't be long now before we're, 6 weeks until we're sowing carrots in some of these beds. What you don't want is any green matter in the way, like a decaying green manure, because that will almost certainly have slugs in there. And that will then eat the carrot seedlings. And it makes it very difficult to do the early sowings and plantings. And that will then mean that you've got bare soil in the spring, which is far worse actually than having it bare in the winter. It's not really bare. So it's always a compost mulch, no dig. That's the essence of no dig. Your soil is always covered with something. If it's mulch in the winter, and the mulch in a damp climate is compost, because that doesn't harbour slugs and it's already converted organic waste, whereas the mulch in California, for example, might be less decomposed organic matter to conserve moisture that will rot in more slowly. And
brilliant. Well, we just had one final quick word, if you wouldn't mind. We've had lots of questions on seed sowing, and somebody said, could you perhaps just give us a little bit of advice, a quick word on seed sowing? Then that really will be the last question.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, well, it's the topic of the moment. the thing I would say though is don't sow any seeds yet. It depends a bit where you are. Obviously, if you're in Florida or San Diego, yeah, by all means, you've probably been sowing all winter. But in temperate climates, say zones 4 to 8, for example, we start sowing mid-February at the earliest. And you've also got the weather to consider. Like in Northern Europe at the moment, there's been a southern stratospheric warming, and there's a big block of cold air sitting right on top of us, and I think it's going to be there right to the end of February. So I'm actually going to delay my sowings a bit this year. There's no point in sowing seeds totally by the calendar if the conditions are inappropriate. So there's a lovely little axiom that in the spring, later sowings catch up. In the autumn, it's the other way around. In the autumn, you're running out of time going ahead. So if you delay your sowings in the autumn, they don't have time to catch up later because it's getting darker and colder all the time. In the spring, it's the other way around. Ahead of us, it's a very much an improving picture all the time. So don't worry if you feel you're a bit late, and if people on Facebook are saying, oh, look, I sowed my courgettes already, or whatever it might be, tomatoes. I sow my tomatoes on around the spring equinox, 20th of March. Certainly no earlier than the middle of March. You know, there's no need to sow them any earlier. I find that they grow so fast as plants in April, and that catch up, you know, the earlier sowings that were struggling a bit because they didn't have enough light and everything. So don't worry to sow too early. And at the moment, it's sowing only under cover, and that means that there's one important guideline, which is that you need more temperature, more warmth to germinate seeds than you need to grow seedlings. Think of it in those two separate things happening. So germination needs more warmth, and that's why you can bring your seeds into your house, put them even beside your the warmest room of the house. They don't need light to germinate. And then once you see that first little shoot, move them to a windowsill or somewhere. And if you're going to be raising your plants in by a window all the time, it's probably worth investing in grow lights, because there's not enough light from a windowsill to take a plant to a decent size for planting out in the garden. Yeah,
brilliant.
I'll stop there.
Well, thank you so much.
Do check out my videos. Actually. Okay.
Sorry?
Yeah. I was just going to say, you know, I've done 3 videos on propagation, and they've got a lot of those ideas in. And I'll just put in a plug for my new module tray, actually, but I've had to be very careful doing that because they keep selling out. But if you can get hold of some good kit for propagation, you know, that's a really good investment. I'm always saying that you don't need many things to be a successful gardener, but good kit for propagation, a good propagating compost, and you know, an undercover space if you can afford it. If you get even a little one in your garden, you can raise a lot of seedlings in there. That will massively expand the range of what you can grow and your season of growing. And so propagating kit and a bit of decent composting, away you go.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. And, you know, a virtual round of applause from everyone. You're welcome to turn your videos back on now and add any comments or thanks in the chat line. We've had some really positive comments from everybody in terms of, you know, people who've done your courses, people who love your books. And Steyning Books, our local bookshop, is offering Charles's books at 15% off. So please have a look there. And we're going to finish now. Just behind me, as I say, Charles is the first speaker in our Green Books series, but we've also now, our next speaker is someone you might know called Dave Dawson, who is a real expert on bees and the jungle garden. And that's going to be the first Thursday in March, and that will be the regular time for our talks. So I'd like to thank everybody for coming. It's been fantastic. We're always looking for volunteers to help us with the videos. If you've liked what you've heard tonight, if you want to be involved with greening Steyning in many different areas, volunteers, we deal with transport, energy, biodiversity. We've got some very active groups, recycling, shopping. A lot of the people from Greening Steyning are on this call, I've seen. We'd love to hear from you, and there's lots of links in the chat. But Charles, thank you again very much for being our guest tonight. You've been wonderful and very, very generous with your time and advice. I think we've loved a huge amount. So thank you very much again.
Okay, cool. I'll just say you've done well to get Dave Coulson. He's a good guy. I'll come to that one.
Excellent. No, please do. You'd be very welcome. You can ask some questions. Excellent. Brilliant. Well, thank you, everyone. That's now the end of our webinar.